Manikandan sir for this podcast.
Right,
An
right.
amazing view on what computer vision has to be. I'm trying to demystify with Manikandan sir. It's not about the approaches what you are giving today. It's all about the engineering thought process that is all about today. You have code, you have the GitHub repositories filled with code, but yet there are a lot of insights which a problem statement needs. Thus, here I'm presenting Manikandan sir for this podcast where I try to demystify his thought process in problem solving in computer vision. I welcome
Right.
you,
Thank
sir.
you. Right. Thank you. Hello to all your listeners.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, yeah, let's just start with the question, sir.
Yeah, sure. All right.
Okay, uh, you have been working in a lot of domains now. You have been a part of TCS also. You're also, after a long time, you're going back to the academic world. You know, as an ECE student, you had a
Mm-hmm.
different hope in your life. Okay, as soon as you hear a processor, it was thought as brain. But now AI is in the verge of getting its neuromorphic computing and everything. You know, I just want you to give the difference between a
Okay.
processor, a brain, and how a computer vision system has to be, according to you.
So the processor, the idea of a processor. Okay, I think maybe I can give a bit of a background about myself before I answer your
Yeah,
question,
you
so the
can.
audience would know who I am, what I do. So I am a electronics engineer who happened. So I passed out in I did my bachelor's in electronics in 2011, and I am based out of Kerala. I did Mahatma Gandhi University, and I have been fortunate enough to be interested in and to work on computer vision problems right from my college time. So from the projects that we used to do for myself and for others, and all the jobs I got after that have been focused into computer vision. It's a field I came across. It was a happenstance. I came across it, but I found that I loved the domain, and I so all the jobs I've got have been connected to that, and I've been working for the last 9 years on in different subdomains within computer vision. And as you mentioned, right now I'm going back to school, and what happened. So right now I always wanted to actually study, even though as I mentioned I'm an electronics engineer. I always wanted to, and I was interested in computer vision, but I have never, thoroughly theoretically studied the domain except for a few electives here and there during my bachelor. Understood and I learned about computer vision was picked up from from my job. It was a hands-on experience that I picked up along the way. So it was never something that I was taught. So it's something that I always wanted to do, to actually go back to school, study the domain, be back in the cutting edge of academics rather than in industry. And that's why right now I have been admitted to the Robotics Institute in Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh, and I'm currently enrolled for masters in computer vision there. I will be traveling for this spring 2021. So that's where I am right now. And in this podcast, all I am hoping that I would achieve is that I can give an insight into what I have gained, my very narrow, limited experience as an engineer. I can explain that, and maybe it might be of use to fellow engineers. Right.
Yeah,
So, yeah. Coming back to your question about processor, the difference between a processor and a brain. So me coming from a computer vision background, um, we all have always fantasized about how the brain works in terms of how it captures it. So right from the apparatus, we talk about the human vision apparatus, right from the stereoscopic vision of the two eyes, the ability to maneuver and focus on different objects and pick up much more details, right from the low level textures to the high level scene understanding, right from the vision apparatus of capture through to the sub millisecond processing time of identifying a threat to understanding a scene um, seamlessly. It is something that is so seamless in the sense that you are not even conscious of the way you are understanding something. The way the half, I would say at least 30 to 40% of our brain is you know what do you say, focused primarily towards vision, and it is a big part of our what do you say, evolution and our survival is thanks to a large part of our frontal lobe and the vision that our stereoscopic vision has given us. Now, there really is no comparison to the brain with respect to the processors that we have right now. So that's what I wanted to. That's why I put the exposition of the brain as we have grown with it, and the processor that we have right now. So processor is a crude approximation of our need for somebody to follow a set of instructions. We have a set of instructions that we have in mind, which we write down, and we want somebody to follow it as like we would have somebody like a student would follow the instructions from master. So there, to be honest, the right now the hardware, whatever we have right now, it is nowhere near what a brain is in terms of the neuroplasticity, if you think of it. The fact that the brain can wire itself, nothing out there has reached any of that point yet. So it is a wild stretch to compare, but yeah, that's always the brain is always the ultimate goal. Biomimicry is the biggest, that would be the biggest target that always our we as engineers are. That's a major chunk of how engineers design so biomimicry is a large direction in which we generally follow. Yeah.
Talking about biomimics, there are a lot of insights where problem statements have never been defined. Also, if you want to put a brain as a processor, sorry, installing a brain or a processor in a form of a code or anything, there has been a lot of controversies there, here and there, with the projects also, which the people are doing. I just want to ask you this one question: what do you still remember your first code and your first computer vision project? Like, it was, I know it was called as image processing in those days, but yet, it also comes out to be a computer vision project now. Do you still remember them?
Yes, I do actually. I wrote something in MATLAB. Maybe it was in 2007, I think. So at that time, the earlier versions of MATLAB were out. Even then, there were these toolkits where you could load up an image, manipulate it, convert, find the edges, maybe detect an object and maybe track a particular pattern. So I remember one of the code that we wrote. It was something, that's how I actually got hooked into image processing as a technology. Is when I understood that it's the idea of defining a pattern and the system being able to identify this pattern even when it is moving around visually. It is there is something so it feels so connected to what we as intelligence can do. So it's connected to me much more than any software program I could generic software program I could write, and that was what was behind my sudden liking to this domain overall.
Do you know, like, there has been computer like DXC100, which is from Nvidia. These are the game changers. Whether it's for gaming, whether it's for video rendering, people are using it because matrix multiplication still remains the same. uh, Deep learning, everything is matrix multiplication. Whether you do dimensionality reduction, everything, convolution operation, yes, it's multiplication, addition. Mac units somehow or the other. Mac units were still there when you
Mhm.
were actually entering your bachelor's also. Do you still feel that
Mhm.
computer has really changed by its form factor, or else by the way the technology is actually disrupting it?
In what method do you mean form factor? Do you mean physical, the physical dimension
not
of
not
it? That's
about
what you
the
mean by the
physical
form factor?
dimensions also. Even like GPUs have come out to be like more robust in
Right.
terms of computing. Like, how has the computing world changed today? compared to your bachelor's days, the beginning to the end of it, and how has it changed today?
Right. I think yeah. So the what you're talking about is parallelism. The
Yeah,
GP
yeah,
GPUs, general purpose GPUs coming
yeah.
out, and we being able to code on it. So that has improved a lot of this multiple single instruction, multiple data. So the SIMD kind of thing.
SMD, MD.
That yeah, yeah, yeah. So that idea has helped us in terms of image processing, and generally most computer vision tasks can be, if it is not already in that way, it can be modified into a independent parallel process. Most of it, at least. It is a generalization, of course, but most of it can be. And that is what inherently allows us to um, take advantage of of the parallelism in such architectures, like that you mentioned of the DPGPUs, the NVIDIA, it be the CUDA or the OpenCL. So the reason why we could take advantage is because of the inherent parallelism and data independence uh, of the generic algorithms that we have, like the convolution. So the convolution is the idea of convolution is is more or less foundational to the entire idea of computer vision itself. So, and that operation in itself is data independent, in the sense that one operation in one space is not dependent on the same convolution operation in another space of data. Right. So if you again, so going back to your question, um, going back to the question, so if you look at the history of the system processor architectures and everything, you look at x86 and then parallel architecture of ARM coming up, and I feel you know so there is a you can put a comparison between the two in terms of x86 starting from the late 1980s. It starts at the 1990s time with 8086 and then the rest of it. Whereas the parallel the ARM architecture, the RISC architecture, um, that starts something around 1994 or something, I believe. I'm not exactly sure. There was a time when CISC in the complex instruction sets dominated generic programming problems for the first 20 odd years. So because the system was designed for conventional programming problems, wherein it was mostly sequential. Some of it was multi-threaded. It became more multi-threaded as we could add more processors, and it is it is a causal relationship. As in, when we could add more processors, we started writing code to consume more cores at the same time, do more parallel processing, multi-threaded, multi-process applications, because the hardware could match it. So there was hardware available to take advantage of multiple threads. So if you remember, even by 2008, even in 2006 to 8, there were very few applications which could do multi-threaded programming well. They could take advantage of multiple cores at the same time. So then that was kind of the rise and the plateauing of the CISC architecture, the x86 architecture, with the number of cores it could handle. And we saw um, how the development of the entire x86 architecture kind of plateaued. There were very incremental upgrades over the last 10 years, um, and even with Intel or with AMD, you could compare the last 10 odd year. It might have maybe doubled or tripled its processing capability over 10 years. If you consider Moore's law, it is it is barely catching up to the Moore's law that it would have you, because it is supposed to double every I would say or every or 2 years, right? So even though the process, so there is a physical limit the CISC architecture is putting to your processing capability, and that is where the risk architecture and the fact that you could pile on more more processing cores and which a reduced number of instruction sets in within the given particular die. You have more cores and you have a reduced instruction set. So that kind of helps negate the limitations of the system architecture. Now, talking about GPU, so the idea of a GPU GPU like that of NVIDIA, that came in from the concept of graphics rendering, right? The whole chip was designed for graphics rendering, within it was a fixed pipeline of shaders, and you have things to plot triangles, polygons, graphics. You do lighting, shading, reflections. So those were a few fixed pipelines which could do graphics for you. It started with pure 2D graphics like pixel on pixel, GUI, and all those things. That was where it started. That needed to be accelerated with the advent of GUI programming, and then we later started to have 3D visualizations, which needed the floating point calculations and all the larida of it. So uh, that once it transitioned from the fixed pipeline into a variable pipeline where you could write code and do what you want on the fly instead of something that is frozen in the hardware, that is when we were able to take advantage of those thousands of cores instead of the uh, odds like 2 or 4, or let's say even 32 cores we had in the Xeon processor. That was the limit. So but then now you have for $500 you can get a 3000 core graphics card which consumes less than 250 watts. So as a hardware, it is a great form factor. It is highly power efficient, and the temperature. So in terms of, even the thermals are like much better in terms of an entire system. It has much better thermal. So yeah, so the shift, the fact that we have such architecture has over the last 15 years, the popularization of deep learning um, has been majorly carried by the advent of GPGPUs. Without GPGPUs, we would never be anywhere where we are right now in terms of deep learning and machine learning, advanced machine learning techniques.
Yeah, that's a trend which has really made the hardware industry. The we materials have changed today, and there are a lot of things which are going on. But I always wanted to ask you this one question because I framed this for you. Can we simulate human vision one day?
Okay. Yeah, simulating human vision. As again, I think we kind of touched upon this topic earlier, right? On how what a human vision is,
Is
right
yeah.
from uh, the way the data is captured, the image acquisition from the stereoscopic vision, um, to understanding. You have the peripheral vision wherein you are aware of there is very little accuracy. If I think many of you would have heard this, wherein have you ever noticed the fact that at a given point in time you are only focused on a very small patch of your entire field of view, and you have a if you look at your resolution, your visual resolution right now, if you are looking at the screen and if you're looking at my face, you have clarity over a very small region of your entire field of vision. Everything else is blurred. It has a much lower resolution than the small patch where your eyes are focused on. But it is so seamless that you don't notice it. So if you feel like looking at something else, so let's say an object right next to, let's say this hand right now, so you shift your field of your focus from my face to the hand, and then the hand comes in focus. Um, but you don't notice the fact that the resolution of my face has gone down drastically in your real-time data. The brain handles it so seamlessly that your high resolution vision is narrowed onto a small point in the entire space that you see, and the rest of the low resolution is used mostly for threat detection, sudden movement, sudden action. So if you want to scan your surroundings for this is essentially for survival, right? So you want to scan your surroundings for enemies, animals. So that's why you have need a large enough field of vision, but you don't need high resolution everywhere. You just need it only at the point where you're focused there. And the brain does a supremely great job of handling it so seamlessly that you don't feel that there is a variable resolution in your vision. So just the apparatus of human vision is so sophisticated. There has been multiple experiments, or the people have been trying to recreate or at least try to mimic the way the human eye works by having, let's say, a gimbal based camera, stereoscopic camera which focuses on an object, and it has multiple resolutions at the same time, just so that you so the great advantage of having such a variable resolution of vision is that you have you're reduced your amount of data you need to process. You are not processing, let's say, a 10,000 cross 10,000 image if you're converting it into pixels, because your focus, your high data is coming only from a very small subset of your field of view, and the rest of it is very low resolution. That is the optimization involved here in terms of data transmission, data processing. So that is one of the biggest banes that we have in terms of cameras, because in a particular image, if you're taking a 10,000 by 10,000 image, it is you have to process every single frame, every single pixel in the frame, because we don't know which where is the important area and unimportant area. We don't know. So there have been some multiple experiments where people have been trying to introduce the idea of the uh, variable resolution capture of the eye. So this is just about image acquisition. I have not even touched the processing part of it. So just as an example. So yeah, human vision is such something so far ahead. But yeah, one day, maybe I don't know how long in the future, I would say vision as a problem is a subset of AI. Once we understand artificial intelligence, then we will solve vision. I don't see it going the other way. I believe AI has to be solved first, then we will subsequently, as a natural process, we will solve vision also.
Yeah, I know. Intelligence has never been demystified even today. Even though there are lot of researches going on, intelligence has never been demystified. Nobody has the experience of who is
Right.
the most intelligent person. You say Gary Kasparov. Gary Kasparov is only good in chess, but he is not the most wisest person when it comes to intelligence. AI is something like AGI, artificial general intelligence. We are moving towards that, but we are not even touching 1% of it, because our problem statements are like that. Jitendra Malik, one of the top notch computer vision scientists, he himself says that it takes 5 years to get 99.9% accuracy. That 0.1% accuracy can be a noise in some or the other way. He literally says that, and nobody
Yeah.
cares about it. Thanks for that answer, because I think so. Probably if all the researchers come forth as one force, I don't think they can really simulate or get the human touch as a robotist, or else as a computer vision scientist. I don't think it can never be demystified. I wanted to ask you this one question, because
Uh-huh.
you're from an ECE student. You have been working on a lot of other
Yeah.
aspects also, the system architecture. There are a lot of things which you have really worked in your career. But I want to ask you, what's
Hmm.
the role of
Hmm.
DSP in computer vision?
Role of digital signal processing, right?
Yes.
Okay. Computer vision is fundamentally image processing, and image processing is fundamentally signal processing. So it is essentially a subset of DSP at the end of the day. Everything that we do, the foundation is in DSP, and it is with the foundation of DSP that we can build up the idea of. So generally in DSP, we talk about one-dimensional signal. Um, Image is just a two-dimensional signal. That's it. There is nothing different about it. And if you're talking about a grayscale image, that now if you have a color image, you have RGB, and if you have a stereo image, you have two sets of RGB. That's it. So everything is signal at the end of the day. Just the complexity of the data has changed. So the foundation of entire signal process, it is foundation of vision is in signal processing. That is where it will always be. So everything, it's like the complex equations of mathematics have been derived from the axioms of the basic concept of mathematics. So that is the DSP is the foundation of everything that we do in computer.
Yeah, that actually gave a pretty good answer because DSP is something which is involved in everywhere. It's whether it's GPUs processing, or whether it's the thermal drives which are taking in data and processing it. Everything is DSP at the end of the day. But like you explained a lot about vision, and not closely related to processing, but yet you worked a lot on vision. That's actually amazing. But I want to ask you this one question: what do you feel about the machine learning benchmarks in machine learning today? And also,
Hmm.
if you can comment about me, can you also comment about edge computing, which is being involved in computer vision these days?
So let's take the first question. So you're asking about machine learning benchmarks, right?
Yes.
What about them particularly? What is that? What is the thought process? So there are multiple benchmarks for different problem statements. So what are you getting at?
I'm like, in terms of accuracy, in terms of the architecture which are coming up, there are breast nets which are from the same CNN architecture. There is breast nets which is involved, and there are YOLO models which have been involved, and benchmarking in terms of performance and also in terms of the accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm talking about. And also comment me about the edge
Yeah.
deployment which is
So
happening.
okay. Okay. Edge will come to edge later. I will. I can talk about the accuracy metrics in. So generally benchmarks. When you say benchmarks, um, generic benchmarks. So you take something like a Kaggle competition. There are things like open source data sets, and there are these so-called very unsolved or very important problems in any domain, and there are such problems like in computer vision or machine learning also. So let's say object detection, the basic object classification is one of the foundational problems in computer vision, or object detection, person re-identification, image segmentation. So there are different domains wherein you would like these are again foundational tools that we build in our toolkit of computer vision. So now let's say you have a very accurate image segmentation. That is, I hope the word is clear in the sense that in given a scene, you are trying to draw. Let's say you are drawing a uh, pencil caricature of the scene, and then you're saying these many pixels belong to the monitor. These many pixels are the sofa, and this many pixels are the person standing. So the computer is able to classify every single pixel in the scene as to belonging to in one or many of the objects that it knows. So that is an example of image segmentation. Now, uh, and now when you talk about benchmarks, generally a model, the biggest problem in computer vision domain is it computer vision, the way we do it right now with machine learning. is with the advanced methods of machine learning, especially ones which involve neural networks, they consume a lot of data. It is extremely data centric instead of the algorithms that used to be, which was, the programmer used to handcraft the algorithm. The programmer would have a plan in their mind. Okay, so this image, I need to detect faces in this scene. How will I detect the face? I have to write a logic which will detect the face in the scene, irrespective of how the person, where the person is, and everything. So then, if you have heard about, there is this Lucas Canade, there was a face detection algorithm. So there is a very, that is one of the basic face detectors available.
Even Voila
Um,
Jones, Voila
then,
Jones.
oh right, yeah, yeah, sorry. So, oh right, so sorry, yes. So the idea was, the transition from the eye, the the, when you look at the face, there is a transition of a black position, and then there is a white of the pupil, and then there is another black transition vertically and horizontally. That was a very basic pattern that was used to detect face. Now this is a purely handcrafted method to detect a face in a scene, right? Now, uh, there is, you don't need data, you don't need a lot of data to write this algorithm. But when you ask a deep learning model to detect a face, you don't write any logic. You just say, okay, in this image, this particular area, it is a face, and then you give a million examples of a face, right? And then for that, if you have a million examples of a page, then that will consume what, GBs and GBs of data, just to train a phase detector algorithm. Whereas the original logic of the let's say the Viola Jones algorithm would have maybe a few kilobytes of code involved, and but it is handcrafted. Now, if you compare the two, there is always a fundamental limitation of the accuracy of the basic face detector, which is handcrafted, because it depends on a very cut and right definition of what a face is and what a face is not. So it cannot handle shadows, it cannot handle pose variations, it cannot handle expression, it cannot handle ornamentation, like let's say mustache, or or let's say a bigger eyebrow, or I'm wearing a glass. So I will have to add conditions to handle all those things, and it will be a very condition based code, um, if I have to go that way. Now instead I am asking the computer to take care of the code, but then for it doesn't understand the idea of a face at all. It is essentially doing a pattern matching. And if I want the algorithm to do well in all cases, I have to give data of all variations: young, old, different lighting, different ethnicity. So the if the data is wide and broad enough, then only this algorithm can work well. And that puts the onus on the algorithm to have a lot of data, which makes it data centric. I'm sorry, I kind of lost the question. What was your intended question?
I'm talking about the machine learning benchmarks that you are
Right,
actually working these days, and
right,
also
right.
on edge computing.
Yeah, right. Okay, edge computing, I am not exactly sure how you would connect to it, because the idea of edge computing is, uh, it is, it's like this. So you essentially, you are not processing something on the cloud or somewhere on the central server. It could be in a cloud or it could be in a central server. You're mostly processing it at the location of capture. Generally, you have a array of sensors. It could be a camera, it could be n number of other sensors, proximity sensors, you could be humidity sensor, whatever that you want to capture. Your sensors would be arranged generally in a place where you do not have people who can go and monitor. That's why you have an array of sensors which are connected via possibly Internet of Things, and then you can either decide to process them at the same location, or you can decide to send this data captured by the sensors onto, let's say, a central server, or you could even push it directly using the internet onto a cloud. Now, the I don't know. It is like the reason why somebody would want to have edge computing is mostly because of privacy. You don't want your data leaving your premises, so you want an in-premise solution. If it could be about, it could be personal privacy, it could be about corporate privacy, data leaks and all that. So it could be any number of things. That's the general reason why you would go for edge computing, or else it would have to be a technological limitation, as in you have a connectivity limitation, you have a power limitation. It's in a very remote place where you cannot get your data through to the central server. So you would prefer to have the entire processing done on site, and then you have an unreliable internet through which you could get a very limited bandwidth out, and that we would prefer to get the processed information rather than the raw data from the sensor. In terms of the benchmark, yeah, so I think getting back to it, it is like this. Every benchmark is dependent upon the data that you have, and it is it is an okay process. I would say the benchmarks are okay. They are limited. They're extremely limited because your problem statements that you can define generically are limited. Things like, average precision, if you are looking for overlap between, let's say you have an object detection model, how do you calculate the accuracy for detection? You draw the box. I have a face detection model, let's say. Now if I have to check if my model is accurate, I will ask the algorithm to take this photo, and then I will ask it to find where the face is, and it will draw the face around this, and I will also
Bounding
have my ground
boxes.
truth, which I know exactly. Yeah, sorry.
Bounding boxes.
Yeah, right. Now I was trying to, not use technical terms as much as possible. Yeah, so right. So generally, I would compare the bounding boxes between what is detected in by my algorithm versus what I know is the truth, which is the ground truth. So then that comparison tells me generally it could be an intersection of the two bounding boxes divided by the union of the two bounding boxes, IOU. That tells me how accurate the box is. That's just one metric of doing it. So there are multiple metrics by which you do it. They are limited for the problem statement that you're trying to solve. And the biggest problem is the data, because vision is so data dependent, and most, I would say 50%, not maybe not 50%, I would say 30% of the papers that come out are focused on, you know, handling the lack of data in a particular domain. How would you handle that, or how can you do this with less data? You have heard about, one shot learning, or zero shot learning. So those things are coming up because you do not have enough data to begin with, either because they are not annotated, there is not enough ground truth available for this data, or a lot of the data is private, or it's something like this. You have to detect catastrophic failure of a metal part in a industrial pipeline, let's say, assume. Now you cannot get thousands of images of a catastrophic failure of a mechanical part. So that happens very rarely, and it's bad if it happens. So you're not going to capture the picture of thousands of pictures of it in different locations. So you don't want that to happen. So how do you train for a system? How do you train a system to detect something which you would never want to happen? So you would never have data of the same thing. So those are problems that you deal with, and that's a data dependency part of it. But yeah, I'm going off the topic, so I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that's actually required. You didn't go off the topic. You actually gave us that actual insight which actual computer vision problem statements have today. It's not about the ground, it's not about the data set also, it's also about the algorithm, it's also about how we are making it efficient usage. There are deep image priors, there are a lot of algorithms, lot of things. Thanks for giving that insight. It was not long, it was not short, but it was up to the point only. It was up to the point. Yeah, moving on, I just talked about the deep image priors and all these algorithms, right? I just wanted to ask this one question. What do you feel about the algorithm these days? The advanced algorithms, more advanced algorithms. Neural networks have become more hungry for the data, right? They are more hungry for the data. That means they are
Mm.
hungry for the parameters. There were like 100 million parameters which used to benchmark. Oh my God, it's too much. But now, even if you have a billion parameters, it's no big deal here, because neural networks have become so robust with the computing system. What do you feel about the algorithm these days?
It is. I'm not sure what to feel, to be honest. Me coming from a image processing point of view, wherein I was explaining that I started with handcrafting the code, handcrafting the images, the code itself. I started from that point. I had to transition to machine learning solutions, then to deep learning algorithms. Um, I am ambivalent about it. I don't think it is the complete answer. While it is giving us great results right now, I don't believe that this is the final answer, or this is the future, complete future to all our vision problems. Yes, if you look at it, supervised learning has given us great algorithms that will give us, that will solve our generic problems like object detection. Object detection is one of the biggest problem statements that we have had the largest increment in accuracy between over the last 10 to 15 years. Object detection as a problem has gone leaps and bounds in terms of its average accuracy because of the neural network architecture that we were able to bring in. But at the same time, if you see places, if you look at adversarial attacks on networks, on deep learning networks, how you can change a few pixels in an image, and you can make the network think that it is something else. Let's say you take the image of a school bus, and then you change if, let's say, a few pixel values in it, and then it suddenly recognizes it as a motorboat, or something innocuous. So that shows us that um, while it is great at object classification, object detection and classification, it really does not understand what we mean when we say it is an object. All the adversarial attacks that we see on a particular neural network, what is an adversarial attack is, you are able to change your input image. Let's say you add some very small noise to your input, and so this is a method in which researchers are trying to understand how does the neural network know this is this object. Now let's say you take the image of a cat, and then you add some noise to the image itself, but it is still very visible that it is a cat for you, because you understand the concept of a cat rather than you understanding how a cat, or this particular patch of image, it has cat-like features. That's not how you understand what a cat is by looking at an image. You understand the concept of a cat, and that helps you recognize that helps in recognizing the image of a cat in any orientation, pose, light, and etc. But the neural network does not seem to be able to do that. So if you look at the recent adversarial attack papers on neural networks, you can see even a single pixel attack. There is a if you change a single pixel in an image, you can make the classifier misclassify the particular object in the scene. So that shows the fundamental limitation of neural networks, to be honest, and from the way I see it. And this is a unpopular opinion. I don't know if it is right or not, and it's something we are yet to fully understand. But if you, for me, the idea put forth by Jeffrey Hinton in his uh, capsule network, the capsule networks idea, wherein if you are trying to, so therein he he talks about understanding the 3D shape, pose, and the pose of an object rather than dealing with image as a 2D. It tries to understand the three-dimensional shape and pose of the object uh, as while learning the system, the object itself. So if you look at the image of a cat from front view, or from, you take the image from the top view, it recognizes that both things are that of a cat, and I'm looking at this orientation right when we're training it. Instead of deciding that, okay, I see a few whiskers, I see a hair, a furry tail, and I see a pointed ear, it must be a cat. That is how general convolution neural networks would recognize a face, or let's say an object. There is a very funny example in computer vision. So if you take, this is something that you can simulate also. Uh, in the previous neural networks, so generally we have, how does it recognize a face? It detects eyes. You have seen the paper wherein it understands how a neural network recognizes an object. The first layer or the first few layers would recognize the low level features like edges, textures, like that. So it would be recognizing the transition between black and white or something like that. And then the next level of the next layer of the neural network, or few layers of the neural network, will learn slightly higher level features like corners. It could understand triangles, or it could understand small patches of a particular object. And every subsequent higher layer would understand a larger field of view, and it would learn parts of the face like the nose, the lips, the eyes, the ears, etc. And then the next few layers would understand the whole face as a continuum, right? But it is possible to fool the same network even if you interchange the position of eyes and nose and face, and the lips. You mean, you can have a face which has the lips at the center, eyes at different points, and a nose in the side, and it will still recognize it as a face. Unless it is, if it is, so if you take a very rudimentary face detection network, you can make it detect that as a face. That is because it does not understand the concept of the object as a idea, or as a concept. Rather, it only understands these patterns, and it understands that if these patterns are found together, it belongs to a parent pattern, which is the pattern of a face. So that's the way I see that. It is a glorified pattern recognition algorithm. It is solving great problems, so it is doing well for us. But I think we have a lot more ways to go before we actually truly achieve computer vision.
Yeah, we have not literally demystified what neural network is also today, because people give this
Right.
example of a brain saying that it's 100 trillion synapses, and we are trying to build the synapses in the form of neural nets. I hope we come very close to it in the future. I don't think we are still even today. But every time, when I always used to run the same code, which is given in some or the other guy from different workshop, right? I used to go to a lot of workshops. I also do a lot of workshops. So yeah, this is what I was doing all throughout my life. Even if I run the same code 100 times, the results used to differ. The same data set. Let it
Mm-hmm.
be 100 images of
Okay.
anything. I use FATCON for getting the data, and I literally remove the noises there and here, and I'll just get that image done, and that's how I actually get the data. I also have 15 data sets in my
Right.
Kaggle, which is all on images, and some are on VLSI and some are on. But whenever I run any program, let it be any architecture, anything, we have different results on different time. It can be 80%, 82%, or else 78%, plus or minus of some numeric value. What do you feel about this? Is there
Hmm.
any flaw in the package, or else is there any flaw in the computer only, as an architecture, not in terms of its performance or anything? What do you feel?
Right, right. I don't think so, because that this is expected in terms of the theory of the algorithm. It is expected. So, if what we are solving in machine learning is essentially an n-dimensional. It is the data is n-dimensional, right? And then we are trying to, let's say we are again. I'll go back to the idea of a classifier, wherein you are trying to classify between two things, whether a particular image is of a cat or a dog, let's say. Now you have a feature space which is created from, let's say you have a neural network, and which is classifies an image as a cat or a dog. Now it has, you have a, let's say, a 32 cross 32 image, or a, something like that. You have an input image, and then you have multiple layers of neural network, neural multiple layers of the neurons, and then you have, let's say, a dimension. You have a feature which is, let's say, 1024 length, a feature which is 1024. Now what you are trying to do here is, you have a 1024 dimensional data. Your data can vary in 1024 dimensions, and then you're trying to divide this 1024 dimensional data into two classes, and say that if your data belongs to this area of the 1024 dimensional data, it is a cat, and if it belongs here, it is a dog. Now, and you're trying to create a boundary. It's not in 1D or 2D or 3D, it's in 1024 dimensions. You're creating boundaries, and this is essentially the optimize. We have studied the basics of optimization in bachelor. So if you remember something like the Newton-Raphson equation, trying to
Yeah.
find the optimal value. So that's what we have studied as the very fundamentals of optimization. Now expand this. That was in one dimension. Generally, the examples we do was in one dimension. Expand this over 1024 dimension, and where do we start? So you have to do this process in 1024 dimensions, and how do you define where do you start your process? You pick a random spot in the map, right? And then you decide where to go from. Okay, you taken your, so it's like this, a very so you have a random value of your weight, and so this, the randomization of the weight itself is the reason why you would have random training results, because you are trying to solve this 1024 dimensional equation um, uh, from a different position every time you're training. So as a concept, as a, if you're trying to do the convex optimization in n dimensions, and you're starting at different positions of the data, because your weights are also randomly initialized, um, obviously you will get different solutions, because then there is a concept of local minima, and that you may reach different local minima. You may never know what is actual global minima or not. All that would come in terms of n-dimensional complex convex optimization. It is part of the technology. It is, I would say, while we do not, we cannot solve it, but we understand that that is what is happening. We do not, we will never have the complete view of a given problem, but we understand that there is a, it's like there is always an uncertainty which is measurable. This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, speaking of these uncertainties which we can really measure, you're also a part of robotics lab
Mhm.
in CMU. There are a lot of things where computer
Right.
vision comes in handy when it comes to robotics, and also let it be anything as a problem statement these days. I just want you to point out some canonical problems which we are still facing in computer vision. According to there are a lot of views on problem statements also. Some people gives different set of problem statements, but what's your view on those problem statement that we are facing?
Okay. I don't. So as we discussed earlier, the I would say the fundamental problem is in terms of scene understanding. Understanding what an image or a particular view, it could be 2D, it could be 3D, what it represents instead of the things like, okay, I see a cat in it or I see a person in it. The idea that if you look at image captioning problems, or so that is, I think that is the solving that is the next biggest checkpoint that we can reach in along this journey. Understanding, let's say if I take this picture, that if I take a picture of what I'm seeing right now, the fact that I seem to be in a video call with you, it understands the semantic of it, rather than telling me there is a mobile phone, there is a person. It can understand the semantic behind the scene, behind the objects in the scene. That is, I would say, the stepping stone to understanding, using vision as it is, instead of just an image and objects and pattern matches.
Yeah, you know thanks for that answer, because none of them can try to do that. Not because we are trying to build a human brain project, blue brain project, anything. But yet, as an engineers, I think it's probably some 100 years of problem statement that we are still lagging behind. Even though we have solved some, but yet there are a lot of problem statements there. I just want to ask you this one question: will robot help us in understanding what a human nature is all about? Let it be vision, let it be mannerism, let it be look and feel of the things. As a human, can the robots behave like a human tomorrow? You
Do
can
you
also
mean
give
robot
me,
itself or artificial?
yeah, it can be a robot which you might think. What do you feel about the robotics in these days, and what can it be in the future? And also, you can give me some views on the perspective of the machine or the machine insights which we are talking. Fei Fei Li has actually given the scene prediction, but as a postdoctoral, as a doctoral research, her thesis also was on this only scene prediction and everything, kind of. I'll put the link in the description
Hmm.
for our PhD thesis. Like it's a lot of things which are going on. Can robots really simulate human touch? That's what you answered. Human vision. Can they help us in understanding nature? That's what I'm asking you all about.
um, yeah, so help us in understanding nature,
Because when we see theory
or if it is,
also, because no human being, even though they are in neuroscience, they say that we have not understood what a human brain is. But robotics can give a lot of insights to it. Computer vision scientists can give a lot of insights to it. So that's why I asked you this question.
yeah, I don't believe so, to be honest. um, because we say it is, a lot of it is inspired by biology. Neural networks is not, even though we can say it is inspired by biology, it really isn't. Because yeah because while we discuss the topic about a neural network, we really don't really understand completely how a neuron captures data, how it holds on to data, how it can uh, it essentially learns itself instead of if you look at it. So even now, even if you say that a neural network learned, it learns over millions of examples. But a child doesn't need millions of examples to learn something. It needs maybe 5 or 10 times. If the parent would teach the child, okay, so that is a crow, and it would, the parent would show a crow maybe 5 times, 10 times. But then later, the brain, the child's brain will recognize a crow anywhere. It doesn't need a million examples. It doesn't need anybody to teach it the basic concepts of physics. It understands, the human brain can understand, okay, if I drop the ball from my hand like this, it will fall down instead of up or going sideways. So this, it learns by self experiment. And it doesn't, and nobody teaches gives it the equations of physics, or help lets it simulate all variations for it to gain a generic understanding of how the world behaves. So brain, I don't know. So because a robot in itself, the day when, until the day when the software would be available, and to be honest, it is, again, I'll get to that, because it's never, even though we say it is essentially in the software that is going to be the intelligence that is going to be there, but we are always limited by the hardware. My The way I see it, uh, we always write software which is bound by the hardware.
Yeah,
It's
that's true.
because you a particular, let's say, a skill, a labor, a person who does a laborer, he is always bound by his tool. A software, programmer is bound by the hardware he can run the software on. So only when you have a general purpose GPU, that is when you thought of implementing ideas in 1970s of, cybernetics. The idea was out there of using a neural network. It was mentioned in 1970s, but it was never taken up. The cybernetic system, um, because the hardware wasn't ready yet. So if you the neural net, the idea concept of a neural network went into a 40-year-old hiatus until we could actually have a hardware wherein we could run the algorithm. So it's like that. So the the software is important, but I think the evolution would start like this. We would have hardware which can modify itself, or if it doesn't need to modify it, at least it can sustain variations in the program while running. Because even now, even we talk about machine learning, it is never, people, I think there is a misconception among the public that it is learning on the fly. It never is learning on the fly. It very rarely is learning on the fly. There are systems you can write to do that, but then that is very brittle. It can break with its own checks and balances to check if it is actually learning the right thing or not. So a system that learns on the fly is very difficult to handle even in production right now. So generally it is trained separately, and once then you freeze it and then you implement it in production. So even though you call it machine learning, it has a very set period of learning, and then it is a frozen mind. It cannot learn anything new. So in the first step towards robots being more ubiquitous, more useful, would be when learning becomes part of the program itself, and then maybe one day, uh, so that would be the stepping stone to the nature of life overall. If you're talking about understanding life, the fundamental thing about life is that it can learn from experiences on the fly, right? And that, once we achieve that, I believe that would be a good chunk of understanding intelligence. Yes.
I know you talked a lot about hardware because you are an EC person, person studying electronics and communication and then working in computer vision for a long time. All of us, we intend to give a lot of hardware as an example. I want to ask you this one question. What's that best and the worst hardware that you have worked on today? Don't give me the example of Pentium because I know it had a lot of processing issues those days. You know, you're limited by 4 GBs of RAM. There are a lot of things, but yeah, these days, which is the best and which is the worst piece of hardware that you have worked on?
You mean physically on what I personally have worked on? What did I work on the best one, and what's the worst
That's
one?
one.
You mean?
That's the one.
Okay, okay. Best one I would say we had a cluster of machines, the Hadoop cluster. We had multiple GPUs in the cluster, and then we had used it to solve mapping, 3D map and routing algorithm. We had to create an algorithm which can give, it's something like a Google map, but it is specific for
You're
trucks
talking about
and
S2
transportation.
geography, S2 geography, kind of an architecture.
No, it was no. This was it was something very similar to routing algorithm like Google Maps, but it's
Okay.
something that we had written ourselves. But we were utilizing multiple GPUs connected in somewhat like a Hadoop system configuration, so that it could split the tasks according to wherever when there is a load and everything. So I don't have much of an expertise in that, but that's one where I could see that it could handle tens of thousands of requests in real time every second, and then still be able to chug along fine. So that was like, okay, this is cool. That's when I remember seeing one of something like the Great Machine. Worst machine, I would say, I okay. So it is not really the problem of the machine. So there are these. So in my previous company, I had to work with edge deployments in there are these cameras which are connected to the traffic signals, and you have cameras connected to finding speed violations on the highway. It's in Europe. So there are these very old systems which are connected there. You can't go there and replace things. So you have like very old, even before I think it was some Atom system, maybe a couple of GBs of RAM, and since we can't physically go there, we had to tunnel through a VPN and get into a VNC sort of remote connection into those things, and we had to go through multiple VNCs to get into it. So it was like you connect to one machine, then you connect to that machine to another machine, and then you reach the edge device. So you move a mouse from here, and then you wait for like a minute for the mouse to reach there. So that's the sort of stuff we had to work with. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool experience because, working with VPN keys and also VNC servers, it takes huge time. And also, computer vision task requires a lot of RAM. And having such patience,
Yeah.
I think probably I would have quit that company the day I would have got the project. Sorry for it, but I am not that patient enough to wait for 10 minutes for moving a mouse. Yeah, you,
Yeah.
you just told about the experience, right? I just wanted to ask you this experience wala thing. Do you have any experience where you felt like I could have done this in 5 minutes, but it took me a longer time? Is there any experience in your career or else in your uh, uh, way to write the algorithm or a paper or anywhere? Is there any experience like that?
Um, I yes. In terms of vision, so the thing with vision is that um, it's like this. So you would design an algorithm in your mind. Okay, okay. I need to. So let's say I was given a problem statement to detect and track um, people in a store. In a, let's say you retail store, think something like Reliance Fresh, or Reliance retail store or something. So imagine there is a retail store which sells clothes. It's not Reliance. I'm just giving an example. So you have a giant retail store with multiple floors, and then you have there are customers coming in and trying clothes in different sections, and then you want to um, detect a person but not detect his or her identity, because you want to value privacy, and then you want to track where this person is going, what they are interested in, what they are not interested in, where are too many people standing, and maybe who might be needing assistance. So you're trying to derive analytics in a retail environment using cameras. So what we had was something like a fisheye camera which is mounted on the ceiling. So you are looking it's a 360-degree image. I don't know if you've seen such images. It looks like a circle because you are looking 360 degrees. You are not looking at a particular 90 degree or a small field of view. You're looking the entire 360 degree, and theoretically you have infinite range, but actually when you go further and further away from the camera, the person becomes so small that you can't really perceive the person. So there is an effective range with below the camera where you can see the actual person. So there are problems. So we had thought of a very simple tracking algorithm wherein you detect the person, and then the person is walking from the base of one camera to the other, and you are supposed to you recognize, okay, let's say you are walking below one camera number one, and the camera one gives you an ID of one, so that it knows where you are at any given time. So when you walk to camera number two, like the mobile phone handover, uh, the ID gets handed over to the next camera, so that we have a continuous history of you moving around everywhere, right? So the problem here is that so we wrote a very basic tracking algorithm, so that okay, I know you, I detected you, recognized you. No, I write something based on where you were, at what time you were, and which direction you were moving. I would estimate where you would end up, under which cameras, which sector, which approximate location you would end up. So it's easier to match outgoing ID with an incoming ID. So that okay, so it's ID one that has come. So it's Vishwas that had went out of camera field of view of camera one, and it has entered the camera two. Now that is all well and good in theory. Now you take the idea of so now then we went into an actual store to test our algorithm. Now the thing is, you have a light illumination hanging from different orientations, and they have different colors, and then you have the ground which is of shiny texture with a different gray cemented ground, and then you are looking at a person from the top, which is mostly hair. There is not enough detail to detect and track a person. So then so the simple ID based handover did not work, because everybody looks the same, and when there is too many people, it is difficult to find who is what. So once you go away from one camera, we really don't know where you are, because if there are like 100 people in the camera in the field of view, it's very easy to lose track of you. So then we had to implement further person re-identification algorithms. Like we actually had to do feature extraction from each person. Okay, what sort of cloth they are wearing, the exact feature of a person we had to train in real time. We had to train a SVM which learns each person in real time, so that I can use this SVM to detect the person when he comes out in the next camera, and then we delete that guy. Then we train a new SVM again, just if he walks out of the camera again. So it yeah, so such simple problems sometimes may not have simple answers. It might take some complex algorithms, but yeah, maybe it could have been solved better. I don't know, but it was something we did then. Yeah.
Yeah, talking about simple solutions, right? You actually worked on real-time hardware and software. Now I want you to comment on FSD computer, the fully self-driving computer which Tesla gave. Waymo is also coming out with
Mhm.
its first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation self-driving hardware also. All these hardware is doing amazing now, because of course there is an breakthrough in which 21st century has given a lot of edge for AI and ML developers. Lyft is giving the data open source, Waymo is giving the data open source, fine. But what do you feel about software architecture these days? When you go to microservice guys, they are working on an architecture which is in some sort a rigid one for their purpose. But yet, what do you feel about the software architecture which is given to the community of computer vision people like us and you? And what do you feel about those architectures in general?
I personally don't think there is. So let me try to understand your question. I believe what you're asking is, do I believe the open architectures available, they are competitive enough to the possible
Yeah, yeah, and also present
you know,
software architecture these
proprietary.
days. Yeah,
Okay. Present software architectures, do you mean, so there are these frameworks that, let's say,
yeah,
things like
frameworks
TensorFlow,
also,
PyTorch.
frameworks. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the way I see it, at least I don't see the people holding on to proprietary technology in this domain, at least as of now, because it is such a fluid domain right now. What is the state of the art right now is way behind in 6 months. So the fact that there is no real point to holding on to something. So the way we have seen companies reacting to it. So like be it Waymo, be it Tesla. So Waymo, I believe, is again an offshoot from Google self-driving only, right? I believe so.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So
It started as,
it
as
is
a Google
Alphabet.
self-driving car project, and now it's company now.
Right. Yeah. So to be honest, I don't really see it to be. So there is very little to be gained by keeping the data proprietary, and I see a lot of openness among the researchers, because the problem statement as it is cannot be solved by one group of people. So that's why the reason why TensorFlow is out as an open source, be it PyTorch, I believe it's from Facebook.
Yeah, it's from
Um,
Facebook.
uh, yeah, so the reason why they are making it open is because it is visible that if you isolate yourself, you will never be at the cutting edge. And making sure that you are opening your technology up is the only way to be at the cutting edge right now. Maybe later when things are more, um, stable, when things more plateau, when the technology progression plateaus out, maybe people may resort to, holding on to proprietary algorithms. But right now, I don't see that, because it's so variable, it's so fluid that yeah, you really, there is no point trying to close yourself up. You have to open up yourself.
Yeah, being open source is somewhat good because it gives us access to a lot of computational resources which we can't afford it. There are companies which give proprietary, but we can't afford it. But there is open source stuff like Python, R. There are a lot of things in the open source community. But yeah, I want your view. This is the last question on self-driving car. There is sparsity
Mhm.
involved, data fusion, sensor fusion. There is a lot of things which is involved. All these algorithms are brute force. They require huge and huge of algorithm. FSD came in, but yet it's working absolutely fine because their purpose is different. But now, what's your view on deploying such a kind of an rigid architecture or a rigid pipeline into an edge deployment? That's what world is moving towards. Everybody wants to do edge because cloud computing has a lot of issues these days because 5G is not yet open now. So what do you feel about these kind of crazy ideas which are coming out in the world of science?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't think so. If you look at the progression from 3G to 4G and now to 5G, it has barely taken 20 years. Not even 20 years. I would say it has barely
Probably
taken 10 years.
10 maybe. I saw
Yeah.
2G for a while,
So,
then I saw 3G. Yeah, it kept rolling in and out of the tech.
right, right. So, to be honest, it is as you said, there is a trade-off. So, um, the reason why we had discussed a few reasons why you would want to do edge computing. One of them was privacy. Now this is another reason:
Latency.
reliability. Yeah, latency, reliability. You don't want if you're especially if you're something in a moving vehicle where you're not always sure you will get network all the time, unless it's going to be something like Tesla Starlink, and then you'll always get network wherever you are via satellite. But as of now, we cannot get reliable network all the time. So then it makes sense to have the processor local. Or if you need to make quick decisions, like you said, latency. If you need to make a decision in 100 milliseconds, you cannot have the uplink and downlink time added to every processing involved. So then, yeah, so that is one physical limitation I do not see solved by cloud. Everything else, bandwidth, availability, reliability, those things can be 99.9% solved. But the physical latency of sending a signal and getting a response back, that there is that the physics is limiting us in there, because uh, it is the speed of EM waves which is limiting us. So therein I see the edge processing still required. Um, yeah. So coming back to sorry, can you repeat the question? I kind of looked back.
Because there is a lot of data sparsity involved. There is data fusion, sensor fusion, lot of things, right? These You actually answered the question, but I also want an answer in terms of vision as an application on edge in a self-driving car, not in terms of any security cam or anything, but as a self-driving car. Do you really feel that application is
Mhm.
feasible?
Well, so if you look at I am not an expert in self-driving, navigation, the hardware and the software part of it. I've worked on some parts of the domain, but I'm never really worked on it as directly on self-driving. Um, so take my view with a pinch of salt, because I have only limited understanding of it. But the way I see it, I would say almost every other company is using a combination of vision and something like a lidar um, or a radar, Doppler radar kind of combination. Except Tesla, I think they are going for a purely vision approach.
No, they are also into
They're
radar only because you know he himself told that using lidar on an self-driving car, you are doomed because it's costly and also it's an overhead. That's what Elon Musk said. They are into radar and vision, but not completely in vision.
But to be honest, as of now, even let's say in the Model 3, I haven't seen any cars out of Tesla which is having an inbuilt radar in it yet. It's
Yeah, they have
been purely
ultrasound, radar, everything. Yeah.
okay, okay, okay. So then, okay, fine. That makes sense, because I do not think the problem of vision of let's say self-driving can be solved purely by vision right now, because there will always be, since this is such a life critical situation, you don't want the system to be as good as a human driver. You want the system to be much better than a human driver, because um, an accident caused by a human driver is a tragedy, but an accident caused by an AI is a disaster, I would say. um, you wouldn't ever want an AI to cause loss of life, because that would hit the public sentiment, then it would hamper the progress of AI. So I would be extra cautious in putting an AI in a in a life threatening situation as a decision making system. So vision as it is, I can think of n number of edge cases where it would fail. Even you have multiple cameras, you have stereo vision, you have night vision, you have IR projected vision. Even then, it can fail in n number of edge cases. So yeah, level 5 autonomy, I'm not so sure. Level 3 or 4 we can easily achieve within a very controlled environment where the roads are clear, the patterns are marked, and I would I would say we would have a easier we would solve a lot of the problems with autonomous navigation if we improve upon the inter-vehicle communication part of it. Because a lot, the 95% cost, I would say, large chunk of the accidents are caused between vehicles instead of if you take away rash driving, a large number of accidents are caused by vehicle to vehicle contact rather than a vehicle to animal or mechanical failure which you can take out anyway. So vehicle to vehicle contact so if vehicles are communicating all the time, a large part of the cause of accidents can be taken out even without self-driving as a sensor-based system. You just need vehicles to tell each other where they are coming, where they are going to, at what speed, and that itself will solve a lot of these self-driving problems without needing to, actually sense the environment in real time. Yeah, I think that may be a part of the overall ecosystem that we need to create.
Sorry for saying that's the last question, because after seeing your views, I want to genuinely ask this question. Because the way you answer, it's not like I was fascinated by the way you are saying the jargons. No, you actually made the understanding for a person who doesn't know this technology at all. I genuinely want to ask this question: what's your approach in building a computer, a team for solving a problem, and what's your approach in solving a problem? That's what I want to ask about. You've worked in team for a while, and you also managed a lot of team. I want to ask this question genuinely to you: how to build a team properly? I am very fascinated to hear about you.
Okay, I don't know what you're asking about. How to build a
Asking about
computer
how to build a
versus
computer,
a team.
how to build a computer or a team.
Okay,
Like you're okay, I'll
okay.
reframe the question. Sorry for it. I genuinely want to ask this question. How to build a team,
Uh-huh.
a proper team which is
Okay,
able to solve a problem statement for you.
okay. Got it. Uh, so there is one parallel between a computer and a team. If I'm designing a computer physically, if I'm designing the hardware architecture of machine I want to use, I would choose the parts. So I will have an idea of the pipeline. Okay, I will choose the RAM, the processor, the storage, the display, and everything. I would understand what is my intended application, what would be the largest bottleneck, and I would try to limit the bottleneck as little as small as possible. Sometimes my bottleneck is that I need fast file opening read write. I have thousands of file read writes at the same time, so I need fast I/O. So then I will tweak my hardware for that. Sometimes I will have a giant processing bottleneck, so I'll focus my processor towards that. Or I have a limited battery supply, power supply, so I need to have a low power footprint. So similarly, the same thing is how I would approach designing a team also. So it all depends on your end goal. So it's like, what is your goal and how will you reach there? And so the steps involved from, let's say, understanding the goal. So since uh, we are engineers and we generally we involve in concepts rather than people. we are more of concept people rather than people people. So we are not great at communicating. They are not great at understanding the actual, um, what drives a person to create. So somebody has approached us to make a system, and they want the system made in a particular way. Now, we generally approach it as a technical problem. Okay, this person. He wants an algorithm which will detect intruders in his building. But what I have seen is over the time, understanding the human being and his actual problem, that would be the first step. um, Instead of I earlier I would just design the algorithm in my mind already when I hear the problem. But now initially I would the data collection part or interacting with the customer, I would say, okay, what exactly is your problem? So why do you want to have a person detection in your security system? What are you actually worried about? Is there a better way to solve it, maybe with a lesser cost, maybe without even a camera? Can we find a better solution to start off the idea of what is it that we're trying to solve? Taking out the algorithm and the system, better to understand the people first, then we talk about the algorithm itself. Now if I know the exact problem and then I am trying to create a team for it, again I would try to understand. So there are the next part of the algorithm, the next part of the entire end-to-end process is I need to know, I know exactly what my problem statement is, and I will need to create a architecture, and I would need to create a plan for how to implement this in a designing, implementation, testing, deployment. So then I plan it out, and then I see why do I need those people, when do I need those people, and plug them in, and reduce, have more number of iterations. If you are gonna fail, you want it to fail fast, so you know you are in the right track or not, instead of going creating something over a month or two, and then you are going in the wrong direction. You make small prototypes, you get good feedback, continuous feedback, all those things. Now if that is what you meant in terms of how to create a team, now if you are
Yeah.
asking me about how will I choose a particular
No,
individual
no,
in a
no.
team,
I never. You can answer that
okay,
also. You can answer that also.
okay. No, if it is the one thing I generally look for in individuals is um, how open they are to learning. And so that is one thing I feel. So overall, intelligence is a very, it's like you can never really say, it all depends on how somebody evaluates your intelligence. Okay, let's say I am taking somebody's interview and I am trying to understand if they are technically sound in a particular domain, or if they are intelligent enough to answer my questions in a domain. So intelligence, while it is necessary, I feel it is secondary to the work ethic and your openness to learn. Because if you are ready to learn, you can gain skill set, and you can even increase your functional intelligence in a particular domain. um, so if you are not somebody who has worked in a domain, experience will increase your intelligence in the domain itself, but you need to be focused to strive for it. So that is the first thing I would look for. Are they ready to learn? And second is, are they a good team player? These two, without these two things, because no matter how intelligent you are, no matter how great of a coder you are, if you cannot communicate, if you cannot cooperate, the sort of problem statements that we are dealing with nowadays, it is never a one man job. It can never be a one man job. So you need to be able to cooperate. And these two things, I would say, maybe unconventional, but that is what I would put as the primary thing. So even if I find somebody who may not be as great of a programmer, as we have a great programmer out there, I would choose the person who has a better communication skills, who has a better attitude towards learning, rather than somebody who is is great at coding, who's great, very well intelligent, but he person is a bit of a douchebag. I would prefer not to take that person, because at the end of the day, you have to work with that person 8 hours a day for every day in the month. So yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for this amazing podcast. Not because like we have a lot of algorithms for computer vision. There are a lot of workshops which offer you certificates. There are a lot of things which can happen while you are learning, but you forget to take the insights to solve the problem. I think every podcast I do, I want my audience or any person. I'm just doing it for my satisfaction, truly saying I don't share my videos to anybody, but yeah, I just get the views. That's for me. No, in order to get the insights, I started this podcast, and I think viewers and me as a person will have a lot of insights from this podcast. Thank you so much, sir. I actually gained a lot of insights.
All right. Thank you, Vishwas, for inviting me for this.
Yeah, sir. My pleasure in having you on the podcast as a guest.